Hello, welcome everyone. I'm gonna give a couple of minutes, maybe a couple is even too much, but some minutes for people to still join, and we'll begin shortly.
Hi, Sarah. Sorry.
Hi, Arrow. Lots of quality time this week.
Sorry for that. Yeah, we're jumping from one part of Europe to the other. Both of us were in Sweden a few minutes, well, a little while ago. So.
Much prefer to be in Oxford.
Welcome, Aromar. Thank you for joining. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I'm just giving people a couple of minutes to join. I'm still getting a lot of people joining. This is like a little bit of like the microwave popcorn, that when you stop hearing the pops every second, then maybe you can start. So I'm still hearing a lot of pops.
Be careful that you don't burn the popcorn too far. If you wait for too much.
Yeah. No, I'll just give it one more minute and we'll begin.
Great.
Yeah, I'm gonna start now. I'm gonna make you Aromar co-host, just so that you can also have access to all the functionalities. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining, and thank you especially to both of our guests. We have today Sarah Colenbrander and Aromar Revi, talking in the seminar that I'm going to properly introduce in a minute, but thanks to all of you who have joined right now. First of all, I wanted to start with some typical housekeeping, let's say, just to remind everyone that we are recording this session. So please have that in mind. The structure of our seminar is going to be the typical structure of our TSU seminars. That has, we will have a short introduction by myself. I am Juan Pablo, or JP, from the Transport Studies Unit. I am a senior research associate here and executive education program director. After a quick introduction by myself, we're going to have two presentations by our two expert guests. After them, their 10-minute presentation, we are then going to have a discussion in which I will chair a little bit of that discussion, and we'll have a conversation for around 30 minutes. And after that, we will open the floor from questions from the audience. In the meantime, of course, as always, please make sure that your microphones are on mute so that we don't disturb others. But please feel free to start asking questions through the chat that I will try to keep an eye on. So keep those going whenever you think that it's the best time to ask those questions. And in the last 30 minutes of this seminar, I will of course open the floor. So for those who want to talk with their microphone, you feel free. You will all have the functionality to open your mic when you need, but please just raise your virtual hand so that I can kind of give some order to the interventions. So without any further ado, in terms of housekeeping, let me just briefly introduce what this seminar is about. This seminar will explore if and in what ways the pledged increase in funding for adaptation coming out of the COP26 may lead to a change in how transport systems are used, designed, and planned. We will address questions such as, will we see more adaptable and resilient transport infrastructures that also benefit those that are hit the hardest? Will this money help shift towards more equitable transport systems, or will it emphasize existing injustices? And what does this mean in terms of the way that different areas of the world deal with changing climate in the short, medium term? So to address some of these questions, we have two very special guests today. As I was saying, we are joined by Sarah Colenbrander. Sarah is the director of the ODI's Climate and Sustainability Program. She has vast experience in developing low carbon development strategies with policymakers across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. She was head of the global programs for Coalition for Urban Transitions. She was lead author of the Climate Emergency Urban Opportunity Report. And she has also worked on climate change mitigation in cities, energy, and forestry at the International Institute for Environment and Development, the University of Leeds, and Forest Alive. So welcome, Sarah. We are also joined by Aromar Revi. He's the director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. He's a global practice and thought leader and educator with over 35 years of interdisciplinary experience in sustainable development. Aromar is an international interdisciplinary expert. He works on the sustainable development. His main focus is sustainable development. He's co-chair of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, commissioner of the Lancet Pathfinders Commission, and one of the world's leading experts on global environmental change and specifically climate change, like today's seminar. He is coordinating lead author of the 2018 IPCC special report on global warming of the 1.5 degrees, and coordinating lead author of the synthesis chapter on climate resilient development pathways of the IPCC working group on adaptation. So also welcome, Aromar. Thank you very much for joining us today. So without anything left on my list, before I give you the floor, if you have any preference on who wants to start, I'll give you that option. But if there are no preferences, I'll ask Sarah to start, given that I have your slides right here for you to begin. So Sarah, the floor is yours, and let me share my screen.
Sure thing. I think that's the appropriate order because we always need a warm-up act before our main event. And so this way, I'm happy to provide some light comedy on finance before Arrow swoops in with the real nuts and bolts of transport. So thank you all very much for joining the webinar today. It's a real privilege to be asked. Big thanks to JP for organizing today's session. I'm hoping to do two things with you today in this presentation, and then leave Arrow to enrich my thoughts with much more substance afterwards before we move on to questions and discussion. The first thing I wanted to do, given that my expectation is that most of you are coming in as transport specialists, I wanted to provide a bit of a background to the climate finance landscape and some of the language and challenges on that side of things, and then begin a conversation about how that climate finance architecture might fit with aspirations for a more resilient transport system. And I know Arrow will speak to that in more detail. So next couple of slides, please, JP. So the first thing I wanted to do is really open up this question about what we're talking about when we talk about climate finance, because the phrase is used for a whole range of different aspects of financing climate action. So ultimately, the aspiration laid out in the Paris Agreement on climate change is that all finance flows would be consistent with climate goals. So that's public, private, domestic, international, north, south, 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 all heading towards 1.5 and 2 degrees. And I'm so sorry about my inbox, which has suddenly gone mad in the background with the beeping. In reality, in a financial system worldwide worth trillions of dollars, actual spending on climate change in 2021 came to roughly $632 billion. That refers to spending, it doesn't necessarily capture all climate spending. Sorry, I'm just going to shut down that background noise. That doesn't necessarily effectively capture all climate spending because some things are difficult to estimate and model, but it includes most spending on things like renewable energy, insurance, the things that are very obviously linked to climate change, either mitigation or adaptation. But as I understand it, today's conversation is focused much more narrowly, and it's focused particularly around the international climate finance pledged by rich countries for poor countries under the Copenhagen Agreement agreed at COP15 in 2009. To date, the target for that agreement was that so-called developed countries, which is actually a narrower subset of countries, but we'll come to that in a moment, should provide and mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020 for so-called developing countries. In subsequent rounds of climate negotiations, particularly at Katowice in 2018, there was agreement reached that $100 billion a year would serve as a floor up to 2025, and developed countries were meant to continue rising above that until 2025, when the idea was that a new climate finance goal would be agreed in the climate negotiations going forward. In practice, it looks like developed countries have not hit that target. We don't have the 2020 figures yet, but in 2019, developed countries had only mobilized around 80 billion. And that was not a very significant increase over the 79 billion of 2018. And about half of that went to adaptation, but the year before only about 20% went to adaptation. So you're definitely not seeing the kind of volumes of finance that have been aspired to in the climate negotiations. Can we go to the next slide, please, JP? So just to unpack a little bit more what's involved in the climate finance goal agreed at Copenhagen back in 2009, the specific language that was put into that particular round of climate accords is on the slide. And I just want to use this moment to show you that finance is not necessarily how one might interpret it based on how it's reported in the media, how it's portrayed by different stakeholders in the system, and so on. The funding is not as narrowly defined as something like official development assistance coming from OECD countries, where countries are expected to report on the grant equivalent of the money that they provide to their developing country partners. It's meant to come out of public resources and so on. So with climate finance, the 100 billion is much more loosely worded. It comes from public and private finance sources, and we haven't really knotted out a methodology for working out when private finance can be reliably attributed back to the efforts of developed countries. It can come through bilateral and multilateral sources, but many so-called developing countries are big contributors to the multilateral system. And public finance includes loans provided at their face value. So even though they're going to be repaid by developing countries, the donor country still gets to claim that whole volume of funding as part of its climate finance. So the starting point is that $100 billion is not 100 billion of grant money from rich to poor countries. It is a much more nebulous target floating around in the ether. And that's something that a lot of people hope will be pinned down much more robustly in the new climate finance goal that will kick in 2025, which is currently still being negotiated. So next slide, please. So just this one here is really just to underscore how we're falling short of that 100 billion target, not seeing the increases we would need to see over the last 3 years to be on track to deliver that. Most of the money is coming through the multilateral system, a lot of which comes as loans rather than grants. And some of it is coming in export credits and private finance, which usually have either conditionalities or have relatively low risk appetites and high return expectations. So really bringing home this point that this is not free money that's coming through the system. It's money that has a lot of contingencies and qualifications and complexities. Next slide, please. I've thrown this one in, not because it's quite as core to transport funding, but because it's a bugbear that's very dear to my heart, which is that the conversation about climate finance and international climate finance continues to be a story about rich countries and poor countries in a lot of the media, and indeed in a lot of the climate negotiations. And so you've ended up with this narrative that all developed countries are not giving enough money to all poor countries. And this slide and the next slide, I just want to disentangle that a little bit. The countries on this table are the countries that are obliged to provide climate finance under the climate accords, the only ones that are obliged to. And this is based on a classification that was put in place in 1992 when the UN climate accords were introduced. And I don't know if you guys have noticed, but the world has changed a lot since 1992. The world has changed a lot in the last 6 months. And so there are a number of countries that are now high income and that have long been high emitting that are not in this list of countries responsible for providing climate finance. So that might include, for example, South Korea, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, all of which are classified as developing countries for the purpose of the UN Climate Accord. The particular purpose of this table is to have a think about, is some work that we did at ODI, which was thinking about, rather than treating the 100 billion as a collective goal, how much should each individual country be responsible for paying based on its per capita emissions, its per capita GDP, and its population? So the first column of numbers is what their fair share probably should be. The second one is what they are actually contributing. And the third column is what that indicates about their progress to fair share. And what you can see is this bunch of Northern European countries and Japan, which are really getting pretty close, in some cases meeting their fair share already in what is 2018 data. And what you can see at the bottom is the big Anglo economies, the US, Canada, and my own country of Australia are falling woefully short on their fair share of climate finance. And that's really striking because those are also countries that are lagging on decarbonisation. So you have this difference within this rich country category of countries that are mostly progressing towards decarbonisation and showing goodwill on climate finance, and countries that are just villains of the climate system. And I say that as an Australian and fully aware of the villainy of my current government. Next slide, please, JP. And this is just showing you which countries are considered developed and developing under the climate accord, and to really underscore that that is no longer an accurate representation of the system. That the yellow category of countries are eligible for climate finance, but they remain this extra category, a legacy from 1992 of countries that were in transition from the USSR, just to give you a sense of how outdated this system really is. So with that context on climate finance, and happy to answer any more of your questions, let's move our attention on to the question of how this might play out for the transport system. 2 slides along, please, JP. Thank you very much. So, of course, and I think many of you on the call will have a better definition of the purpose of transport systems than me, but as a rough and clumsy language, the purpose of passenger transport is improving people's accessibility to get the things that they need, and the purpose of freight transport is moving goods around. Whereas the purpose of climate finance, if you don't mind clicking, is to reduce emissions and enhance resilience to climate change. And so quite clearly, the reason I draw out this disentangling is that investments in transport are going to happen anyway. They're going to happen for a different set of reasons around enabling people boosting the productivity of cities, enabling people to access healthcare, education, and leisure options, to serve firms wanting to reach their customers, and so on. So climate finance can never be expected to pay for the whole of a new transport infrastructure project. It can be used to help with that. And the real question that we have to grapple with when we think about the role of both mitigation and adaptation finance is what proportion of the costs come back to this challenge of reducing emissions and enhancing resilience to climate change. So next slide, please. So very crudely, what you can see here is how that might play out. That first column is the amount of money that a country would be paying anyway for its transport system if climate change were not an issue. Then there's a role that mitigation and adaptation finance should theoretically play in bridging the gap towards making that transport system low carbon and climate resilient. But it's only ever a piece of that whole. Next slide, please. So here's your really tricky question. How do you measure the difference between the different costs between a low carbon transport system or a climate resilient transport system and any other transport system? Because you could certainly start off with the photo on the left-hand side of a highway and improve that highway so it's less susceptible to flooding, but it's still pretty high carbon. A better alternative is having a bus rapid transit system in place in your city, but that's a better alternative anyway than a highway. It's better for air quality, it's better for accessibility, it's better for affordability and energy bills for most of the population. In some cities, the best scenario of all will be walking and cycling infrastructure. It's more pro-poor, it's physically healthier in terms of air quality and physical activity and so on. It's a much cheaper option altogether than either of the first two images. So you have this fundamental challenge facing the providers and the recipients of climate finance about how you make transformational change in your transport system to something that's genuinely low carbon and climate resilient. And in addition to that challenge of envisioning what that might look like, how do you then attribute that back to the climate finance system and get that bit of extra money from international sources to help you in making that bridge? And it's a really, really tricky problem. Next slide, please. So I suspect many of you are transport financiers by background or by training. And so for others on the call, this is just to give you a sense of what some of the other options are that you should be bringing to the table in addition to your transport funding, your international climate finance. Because transport is very substantially a public good, some of it is going to almost always be from public finance, your domestic resources from taxes, domestic public assets like the sale or leasing of land and development rights, international development finance, aid vis-a-vis climate finance. And increasingly, a chunk of it will come from different private finance sources. And blended finance helps you bridge the gap between those two and use public finance to steer private finance towards these infrastructure options by making it less risky or by improving the returns from a transport investment. Something I just wanted to underscore here, which I think doesn't come up enough in conversations about transport infrastructure investment, is this distinction between funding and financing, whereby financing is how you pay for that initial upfront cost of a big capital project, usually by borrowing money in some form and repaying it with interest rates. And very often that's the role where a traditional private finance institution comes into play, a commercial bank, an institutional investor, and so on. Funding is who in the end pays for that service. And usually that is some combination of government and different stakeholders, the people using the transport system who pay by fares, the people who are using the transport platform as a space to advertise, perhaps the households around a new transport hub who are benefiting from rising land and house values. And there's a capacity to capture a piece of that to help pay for the transport costs. Thanks, JP. So there is a slight addition. I focused to date mostly on this question about new transport infrastructure, but of course, many cities already have well-established transport systems. So there's another piece of the puzzle for us to consider relatively briefly, because I'm aware that I've just hit time. And that is, can adaptation finance be used to take existing transport infrastructure and to help climate-proof it? I guess the answer is it certainly can. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But I just want to add a qualifying word around that. And if you don't mind going to the next slide, JP. This is a snapshot of who provides climate finance. And it's a horrific diagram, very impenetrable. And that's because the climate finance architecture is horrific and impenetrable. There are a suite of different avenues through which you can access climate finance, from bilateral sources, and you've seen a bunch of those countries at the top there, and through this wealth of multilateral institutions. At our last count, we found 27 different climate change multilateral funds. And that's in addition to things like the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and these additional multilateral institutions that are also channeling climate finance. And so the headline message from that is that even if climate finance might be accessible and might technically be cheaper, you pay less interest for it, it's a grant instead of a concessional loan or a full private loan and commercial loan, there are very high transaction costs to access it. It's complicated, it's expensive, it requires sophisticated skills and a lot of due diligence at the country end to receive it. And so for a lot of countries, it's just not a preferable option given the nature of the current climate finance architecture. And that needs to be borne in mind, in that what looks like free money does not in fact feel or smell like free money when it comes to the process of actually applying and reporting. And for the last slide, thanks JP, I wanted to just draw attention to two different examples of adaptation finance being used for transport infrastructure. And these speak to both of the two cases that I've spoken about before. In Nauru, the Green Climate Fund is going to play a really big role in paying for the construction of a new port, a port that is going to be built in a way that anticipates sea level rise, anticipates increased storm surge, cyclones, and other climate-related hazards. And the reason that Nauru was able to access so much climate finance, so much adaptation finance for this project is that Nauru is an outlier. It's so exposed to climate risk that it's quite easy to draw out the impacts that climate change is going to have on its infrastructure. It's much harder in a place like Mexico City, where there's many more compounding factors. And the second example is Tonga, which is showing how adaptation finance is being used on another small island state to think through how to take your existing transport infrastructure and add to it, refurbish it in a way that enables it to cope with the flooding and sea level rise and storms that are anticipated. And a striking feature of the Tonga investment is that most of that adaptation finance is going for shipping, aviation, and highway adaptation investments. So actually refurbishing a lot of high carbon infrastructure with adaptation finance. So you have these tensions between different pieces of the climate pie. So really happy to field some more questions about that, but looking forward to hearing some great examples and points from Aro. Over to you, Aro. Thanks, JP, for your help.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a great way to kick us off. Aromar, please.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm not going to use slides. I've just, done 50 slides on the IPCC with 100 people, so I don't want to get by PowerPoint. So I'm just going to talk through a few things. And thank you, Sarah. That was really useful, I guess, for people who don't realize that the climate finance landscape is a spaghetti, is very complex, and is driven by a whole range of political economy factors that we don't take into account. But let me sort of step back and if I look at the question that JP set us, I guess the question that he set us was have the pledge increases in funding for adaptation coming out of Glasgow, will they make any difference to the transport systems and how they're used, designed, etc. I guess we could end the discussion pretty quickly by a very simple answer. At least from my experience, I would say no. And why would I say no? The first thing is that adaptation finance itself is very small, and the second thing is it's a very small fraction of what is potentially required, even if you look at the incremental numbers that Sarah was alluding to. Basically, transport systems are somewhat down the sort of hierarchy, a little lower in the hierarchy of where investments may or may not flow. So that's kind of the stupid answer. But I think if you start to unbundle it, there are a few things that may be useful to look at in both the framing and the negotiations that are happening, because as we're putting together the science on the IPCC, effectively post-Paris, it's become part of what I would call regulatory sciences now. And the quick comment on that is we have a new framing which is kind of useful. It both confounds and provides some interest, and that is something called climate resilient development. It was created in the last IPCC cycle, but wasn't brought up very significantly. But this cycle, I would imagine it's going to become one of the more important parts of the rhetoric and the negotiations, especially as we see it in Sharm el-Sheikh, etc., and COP27, 28, where adaptation starts taking center stage. And it's a fairly simple idea. You take sustainable development, to that you add some mitigation, you add some adaptation, you pretend you can mix it all together, and that's sort of climate resilient development. But that's become the sort of the mantra for a whole range of countries. Some of them hate it, some of them love it, but that's the way the things are going. And the reason I'm saying that is that I think especially for the transport, business or the transport sector, the opportunity of blending adaptation and mitigation is actually quite important. So yes, there's a resilience part of it, and I think Sarah in that graph of us laid it out very well. The question is, first of all, what's the base cost of investment for the dirty old infrastructure that might lock you into whatever it is, and then what are the incremental costs to deal with the decarbonizations, fuel switching, etc., and what are the incremental costs to within notionally to make it sort of resilient, so to speak, right? Now, there are lots of issues of valuation and attribution and stuff like that, but I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. But the reason I'm saying that you do have to bring together mitigation and adaptation is a couple of things. The first thing, of course, is that transport's contribution to the risk that not reaching XYZ targets, whether it's 1.5 or 2, is quite significant. So one of the ways of framing this is to say, look, mitigation is actually one of the most effective forms of adaptation. If you get the mitigation right, you can do a lot as far as that's concerned. That actually reduce risk across the board, and all the downstream processes as far as that's concerned. So I would say, if you were looking at sort of conventional sort of assessment of a transportation project, apart from the other social and economic benefits, I would say putting them together is actually a good thing, especially because if you look at the emissions profile, we're talking about whatever 3/4 of the emissions coming from vehicles, all the stuff that we see running on roads. About 22% coming from shipping, and the rest, in a sense, coming from rail, right? So if you break that down and try and look at it, the question is, both globally and inside a national economy or inside a regional economy, where will you put your resources becomes a sort of important question. And again, to break out the core things that you need to do, the first thing obviously is you need to decarbonize, right? And decarbonization itself is kind of useful, but it's not only the CO2 side of it. It's also you're all experts on this. It's also the N2 side, this slow, the SLCFs and the CH4s, etc., that are important part of that process. So effectively, if you want to try and deal with this question, the carbon markets are often tied to CO2, but there will be other things that will be tied up in that space. And the interesting opportunity, I think, is to make the link with air quality, because that's the most obvious thing that we're seeing. Maybe not so much in Europe, less in North America, but certainly in Asia, that's one of the most dramatic impacts that are there. There's a decent amount of literature and valuation done on the impact of air quality. So if you're looking at the costs and the benefits, the decarbonization and the link to air quality and aerosols, etc., is an important way of doing it. The other thing that's I would say somewhat critical in the valuation process, or looking at how one would unbundle, unpick, and then look at the financing of this, is looking at the electrification of systems. Obviously, there's a lot of interest. You folks work a lot on electric passenger vehicles and maybe on freight. But again, the electrification is not good enough at the end use end. It's the entire system that's involved there. So if you're able to unpack that, then you can actually unpack how the financing will work itself out. Fuel switching is more complex, fine. And that becomes a more difficult thing to do. It's tied to a whole range of technologies, some of them that are kind of underdeveloped at the moment. A lot of discussion about hydrogen in some places. Biofuels are happening in other places as far as it's concerned. But the most interesting thing that we're seeing now in the current round of assessment we've done on the IPCC is really on the demand side. And demand side not only in scope 1, scope 2, but also in scope 3, which is a lot of what transport is talking about. And that's where I think there's a lot of interesting potential of trying to bring together both adaptation and mitigation, because at least the simulations that we have talk about demand side approaches actually, hopefully being able to reduce emissions by about maybe 40 to 70%. This is part of the new discourse. It's not that some of us don't know this. And I think the transport community has been working a lot on this, but the rest of the energy community has suddenly discovered, the demand side is a good way of trying to deal with this question, especially when you have a whole range of challenges that come from, carbon dioxide removal, or where overshoots start playing themselves out. So I think if you want to get a wedge into the system, that's an interesting place to go into. The question then is, if you have to operationalize it, you have to unbundle, avoid, shift, improve, and then start, especially if you have good economists in the team, to try and unpick that and look at what's happening. And that's complex stuff, because the avoid stuff is tied to a whole range of questions on planning, on land use, on economic structures, of demand and supply, etc., that are somewhat difficult to be able to put decent numbers on, and then you have to put the numbers on. Somebody's got to certify it before some money actually comes. Even if it has to flow up as far as that's concerned. So that's one set of things that are there. So I think mitigation is a good way in. The adaptation side is interesting, and the way that at least the market is kind of running at the moment, at least in my appreciation, because we did a piece of work for the Green Climate Fund on this, is there's a partitioning of two sets of risks, right? One is what are called physical risks, which is all the nasty stuff that happens because of climate, among other things. So flooding, sea level rise, and cyclonic storms and storm surge and stuff like that. So the physical risk stuff, which is what a lot of what resilient infrastructure is kind of focused on, and that might possibly be dealt with by using conventional risk financing, but also potentially blending in risk financing along with some adaptation finance. The market is not very well developed in this. The instruments are kind of building out in some senses, but that's one way of doing it. The other one, of course, is the transition risk story, which is where a lot of the macroeconomic interest is actually running. And I think the interesting idea in some senses would be to bring them both together, because physical risks to transportation infrastructures are easier to assess. They establish systems for doing it, maybe not for entire systems, but certainly for elements of it. The question is on the transition risk side, because transition risk can deal with not only new infrastructures, because they will also have transitions as the climate game plays itself out over time, but also existing ones. And you need to kind of bring them both together, I think, in a sense, to build a portfolio when you're dealing with it, because somebody owns these things, right? Whether it's owned by a public utility or it's owned by a whole range of private interests, you have to probably try and bring these things together so that you have a pooling of risks that then could be kind of could be financed. On top of that, there is kind of, I would say, gilt money, which is focusing on dealing with things like just transition. So there is ESG resources that are starting to come into the space, which even if they may not come in as grant resources, can actually start bringing down your cost of capital significantly in some places. So that's another thing that you need to look at. Sarah showed you the whole architecture of public and private finance, including all the way out from whatever it is, from public ODM money to financial institutions that would FIS to come in and do stuff. But I think the bringing together of these multiple pools will be an interesting thing to actually do. And because a lot of structured transportation projects are fairly well organized, it would be interesting to see how they can be. I mean, in India, for example, we're building like 20 metros to try and see how you can break it down and not only go for the traditional carbon financing kind of stuff that's there. So, that's the other set of questions that I think that are worth looking at: the unbundling of the physical risks and transition risks, trying to add on some elements of justice to that, and either bring down your cost of capital or dealing with some resource flows as far as that's concerned, to kind of deal with these kind of things. So, having said that, how does one kind of structure it? I think the big argument there, which is it's a macro argument, but it sits at the back of all of this process, is that transportation sits within a large sort of bucket of things in the infrastructure sector, whether it's new build or retrofit, in which there is a fundamental gap in most economies across the world between where savings and investment is and where the infrastructure investment should be lying. So there's a fundamental infrastructure investment gap that's there, and that's what's driving, in a sense. So what's actually happening at the moment is a conflation of how to solve the infrastructure gap, financing gap, with the question of climate financing at the same time. And they are two different things, and they have to be addressed with two different sets of a whole different family of different kinds of instruments as far as that's concerned. So I think the focus of work in the transport sector should be on the incremental financing, but that assumes that you've got your head straight around the question of actually financing the core infrastructure that's there, and in all of its elements. Yeah, because we're talking about assets that will be created over whatever 30, 40, 50, 100 years in some senses. What's possibly going to be happening because of this big movement on ESG is that we will start seeing new asset classes being created. And the interesting thing then to see is how to be able to construct and sort of unbundle what you're doing in the transport networks, depending on the mix of public, private, etc., into various asset classes, which could then be sort of broken up, like I said, on the financing side, to deal with the risks at one end, or the benefits of decarbonization, air quality improvement, demand side, etc., etc. And frankly, we don't actually have very good metrics to do this kind of stuff. There are very few really interesting projects that have done this kind of stuff in the infrastructure sector generally. It's a little bit easy in other places. Energy, of course, is fairly clear. Water is starting to do this in some places. So I think it will be quite interesting to try and see how we can sort of latch on to a few things and look at first, from the economic point of view, breaking this down and sort of breaking out the end users, the values and the costs and the benefits, and then trying to put some values on each of these things, whether it's in terms of the outcomes and the benefits or the risk side of things as far as that's concerned. And finally, something that's I think going to be quite important when we look ahead and you're trying to structure a large investment. Many of these of transport systems, even if they are paratransit, et cetera, in developing countries, cities, are going to be net positive on carbon, right? So in a world in which you're going to have overshoot, there's going to be a lot of screaming and shouting about carbon dioxide removal. So one is an offset story, but the other question that you have to start thinking about, I would think, is how do you integrate this? And like we're doing transport-oriented development, are there ways of thinking how in the avoid, shift, improve kind of framing, the way that you structure a transportation intervention or process or a system actually contributes to some outcomes in that space. So there are CDR opportunities that will build up in other areas. This is a completely sort of greenfield kind of space at the moment. Most of it is focusing on how you can grow things, etc. But both in the infrastructure itself and the carbon capture inside it, and also later in its use and how it plays itself out, there are interesting opportunities there, because that's, I would imagine, going to be a fairly interesting market that will build out over time. There's going to be a lot of speculation in the beginning in that, but eventually it will get more structured and more processes will play out in that space. So I guess I'll shut up there. I hope I made some sense.
Yeah, that was great, Aromar. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you both. I think that we are off to a great start. I want to emphasize to our audience that you can start asking your questions already. As a chair, I can start asking questions of the topics that I find more interesting. But if you don't start asking questions, then I'll just ask whatever is interesting to me. And that's not necessarily the case for the rest of the audience. So please send your questions over. And in a few minutes, I'll just open the floor for also questions, like live questions. But in the meantime, I wanted to kind of bring an additional element to our discussion, which is like subnational structures and civil society groups, and how do they, like, what role do they have to play in all of this? And I may be throwing a little bit of a curveball here to both of our speakers, but I think it relates to the last point that Aromar was just making. But I'm very interested in kind of knowing. Sometimes I feel that the way that the climate change financing structure is built, if it's already all confusing to a lot of experts and a lot of people that work on this on day to day from a national level, at a subnational level, this is even more inaccessible. And it worries me that the way that this money is flowing through the system, it's not going to reach the people that are going to suffer the most within the countries. So there's this tendency of thinking, like you were posting these interesting examples, Sarah, in having like rich countries and poor countries and the money moving in that direction. But my question now is more in how do we get from rich, powerful people in poor countries to the rest of us in the countries, multilateral banks. The clients are countries and not individuals or civil society groups. The way that infrastructure investment happens in most of the world takes little account of local communities. Aromar was also talking about the connection between scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and in scope 2, the generation of electricity for these transitions always happen at the expense of local communities in many of these countries with hydroelectrics and things like that. So how do we, where in this big picture does the local communities, civil society groups, where do they fit? Do they fit at all? Should we start creating some systems in which their voice is heard a little bit louder? Or are we just talking about different ways of financing and maybe this is not the right way to do it? And that's kind of pointing at, if we are spending all of this money through these existing infrastructures that are already ignoring these voices, aren't we kind of emphasizing the injustice system that already exists? And then, yeah, I don't know if that kind of provokes enough comments from you, but that's more or less the lines in which I was thinking.
JP, you could ask us anything and you can provoke comments from Aro and I, so don't worry too much about that. Aro, do you want to field these first or would you like me to?
No, go ahead, Sarah.
So let me take first the subnational governments and subnational actors and civil society question. So an area that actually Aro and I independently have both done some work is this question about how climate finance gets channeled down to the local level, whether that's city governments, local civil society, state level decentralized climate funds, and other entities. And as you say, JP, climate finance for the most part is not designed to do that, particularly when it's dispersed by the multilateral system. It usually goes to other multilateral actors. A huge amount of green climate fund money goes to UNEP and UNDP to deliver in partnership with national governments, but nonetheless through the multilateral system, or it goes to sovereign governments. If it does go to subnational actors, it almost always has to have a sovereign guarantee and sign off, particularly when it's debt, because that debt of a subnational actor ultimately sits on the balance sheet of the national government if the subnational defaults. So you're absolutely right to flag this as a concern in terms of adaptation finance reaching the most vulnerable. Having said that, I would push back on how this plays out, particularly with the transport sector. So to my mind, it's fairly self-evident when it comes to some aspects of adaptation spending and to a lesser extent mitigation spending, that there are clear opportunities to help local actors to empower them with the resources necessary to act. But in the case of transport, particularly when you're talking about large transport infrastructure projects, those would rarely sit with the subnational actors, with a few exceptions like Indian states, Brazilian states, Mexican states, so where it's a federal country. And even then it doesn't really sit with a local actor. You know, the state government of Uttar Pradesh has how many millions of people within its responsibility. So I think the question would go back to you then. When you talk about adaptation finance for transport reaching local actors, what might you be thinking of there? Because the construction of integrated cycle networks, the construction of a bus system, the refurbishment of those systems would very rarely sit at the local level itself. So there's an interesting tension there between the response. I think there's a question there about accountabilities. The larger authorities that are responsible for transport investments should absolutely be making those transport investments pro-poor, affordable, serving communities that might otherwise not have access to transport networks as things currently stand, but they might still be the logical place and the logical actor to have ultimate authority for delivering that transport investment. So there's a bit of a tension within this sector that plays out much less in other sectors, given the scale of capital infrastructure needed.
Yeah, thanks.
Go, Aro, please.
I just build on what Sarah says. In fact, I'm just going back into a consultation with like whatever 20 mayors across Europe on this kind of question. So first sort of fairly sort of blunt thing on that, and that is that adaptation finance is under 20% of the square root of almost zero compared to what's actually required in terms of financing. So the question is, if you were a local actor or you were even a local, whatever it is, urban local body or municipality, would you really go for the adaptation finance, or you go for something else? And I think that's a core question in terms of, and I'm talking from a global south perspective. So I would say, if you really want outcomes that are reaching out to climate justice in many parts of the world, in the global south, in Latin America, many parts of whatever, Africa, certainly Asia, which I know a little bit about, your core objective would be to try and improve access, right? And the question then is, would you be able to get hold of financing at a risk-adjusted or not risk-adjusted weighted cost of capital lower than adaptation finance? Now, Sarah has just shown you the tremendous friction there is in the climate finance system. And you can add it up into hundreds of basis points. because on top of that, there's political risk and X and Y and Z. If you're looking at the real system that's there are lots of other ways of getting resources. They're still relatively high compared to LIBOR or wherever you are. But if you add adaptation finance to it, unless you're extremely smart or there's a deal that's made somewhere in the background, I would say the financial closure of those projects will be actually quite difficult. So I'm somewhat contrarian in some senses. What I'm saying is, if you want to get something going, you've got to get your process going. You structure it properly. It has to be structured in your urban context adequately. It does all the good things that need to get done. It doesn't give you any dramatic improvement in that by taking an adaptation finance angle to it to get the financing right. It's good to do that because if you go through the multilateral bank processes and they take a long time to do, you'll get a tick boxing in the beginning, which will hopefully improve the resilience of your infrastructure. So in that sense, it may last 50 years or 60 years. It may have a little bit more to do with environmental justice locally in the city and X, Y, and Z. In that sense, it may be useful. But for the most disenfranchised people, like the people who walk in our cities, or maybe ride bicycles when the AQI is 350 or whatever it is, that's not going to reach them. So I would say the strategy for that is really to raise the floor in terms of service delivery and access, and that doesn't require, at least in my opinion, in the short run, it's not so good to use adaptation finance for that because people don't get it. The mechanisms are not in place, evaluation processes are not in place, certification is not in place. It's easier, I would say, pragmatically, to use mitigation finance because that's easier, and some people understand carbon offsets and X, Y, and Z, or even carbon financing. So you might get the money quicker and sort of in a much easier way to deal with that. So that's maybe a contrarian position looking at what one sees and has observed, because the real thing at the end of the day is that risk-adjusted cost of capital for the financing side, right? Because other things are useful. You'll have somebody who comes in the beginning and reduces your risk because they're either a World Bank or X and Y and Z, and everybody else lines up behind them because as far as the rating agencies are concerned, it's a relatively low risk project. Eventually, it's a market, right? So there's no free money out there, especially for poor people. They pay a lot more than rich people to get access to their services.
Yeah, thank you both. I think that those are very interesting points. I do some of my research in Colombia, and I do it in a community in which the buses rarely manage to reach up in the mountains in Medellin. And sometimes when the local authorities start talking about electric buses and things like that, I wonder, are these buses going to reach these people? But still the floods and the big rains are affecting them directly. So that's kind of the things that, but I think that you've already given some points that speak to that, which are very interesting. I wanted to also look in another direction now, not only in terms of the subnational governments, but also and structures, let's say, but also look in terms of how climate change, adaptation, and mitigation financing connects with other sources of sustainable development goals and financing for those different goals. Because my impression sometimes is that this, as you were presenting, Sarah, for example, how you were spot on by specifically saying the money that you need to build a big transport infrastructure, the part that it corresponds to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation is a fraction of the reasons why you are investing in this infrastructure. But my question is then, are there ways to try to steer away from this compartments approach in which I am basically saying this is for climate change, this is, and in a way of connecting with other, like every cent that you invest in transport could be justified in many ways, and we all bring to the table and we all put it in a big pot, and then we share kind of the benefits of all of this instead of compartmentalizing, and in that way, again, just going through typical channels of the transport system without a radical change. I believe that if we manage to connect these different sources of finances, we could achieve radical change in the transport system in a much more cost-efficient way. And dividing them into boxes maybe is against that, but maybe I'm wrong. So I would like to hear your impressions on that also.
I don't think you're wrong, but I think Aro is better placed to take the first stab this time.
So the thing is this, I mean, in a lot of places that I'm a little familiar with, the incentives to do a void shift improve, for example, I mean, there are limitations with that, and we all know that kind of stuff that's there, are very weak, right? I mean, at the local level, even at the national level, that's there. First of all, because most of the incentives and the sort of and the drivers are not at the systemic level. They focused at particular sets of things. There are end of pipe stuff for pollution for particular sets of things. There's subsidies for batteries for electric vehicles and this and that and the other. You're playing around inside the fiscal system to incentivize something because it's a flavor of the year or the month or whatever it is. So there's a deep challenge in that. So basically, we need to look at systemic changes, and within that, to be very pragmatic and look at what the big where the big value is. I think part of the challenge is also an analytical frame challenge. That is, the climate business is kind of moving on to look beyond cost-benefit analysis, right? So we now talk about multidimensional feasibility, which brings in other factors. And the really fancy people talk about culture, but most of the other people are still talking about microeconomic, technical feasibility, etc. So there's an idea that CBA is a challenge. But if you look at the portfolio of most multilateral agencies that are doing this stuff, and they're, I would say, the cleanest set of folks in this business because they're stuck with all their checks and balances and all the governments that they have to report to. They're not going very far in terms of method as far as that's concerned, right? So at the most, you bring in risk into that process, and somebody would value risk. And if you have risk, then you look for some kind of an insurance kind of instrument, and then you have to look at reinsurance, all of them adding on again to that cost of capital question, let's say. So what I'm saying is that I think we have to think on the method side of how to redefine a little bit or expand the definition of both costs and benefits. So it's difficult. So it's easy if you're a microeconomist trying to prove that your particular investment is actually working yourself off, and you're going out to a MDB board and wanting to get something approved to say, now air pollution is a really cool thing to do because it's easy and you do dailies and you can actually you can switch the multipliers on the benefit cost ratios, which then clear the investment committees and then the financing happens, right? So I think one has to look fairly carefully at that space and the methods that are used. Unless you look at that, I don't think we're going to get any significant differences in practice. And I think that's where the academic community engagement with policy people and practitioners can start doing this thing. I mean, sort of internalizing risk is a simple part of is one part of the process. But even figuring out how you bring in other intangible elements, I think in environmental economics we have a lot of different ways of trying to do that. But I don't work that much in the transport sector, but I haven't seen too many transport projects. I mean, we're doing a metro at the moment in Bangalore with ADB financing, and looking at this, I don't see any of that stuff happening there. Is that a good enough provocation for you, Sarah?
Dazzling, Arrow. I love it. I think just to continue what Arrow was saying, I think in some cases the challenge is not the question of that little bit of adaptation finance, it's your total resource envelope. In an ideal scenario where Bangalore sits is that it designs the transport system that best manages all of its trade-offs and delivers on all of the synergies to get a greener, more productive, more inclusive, more resilient city in place. And you're never going to be able to do all of those things, both because of the political and challenges of getting that through, where there are vested interests, particularly relating to land, and where there's technical challenges with disrupting your entire city to move from a network of roads, often ancient roads, and replacing that with mass transit or cycle lanes. You have cultural barriers, etc. But there is also this total financing envelope. So we always start in a second or third or fourth best position. But I think that the broad point that Arrow was making, which is you design something that is broadly feasible within an envelope of grant finance, and then subsequently, the thing that the Green Climate Fund has become much better at in recent years is when someone shows up with a project with other sources of financing, recognizing that climate is a piece of that puzzle and contributing accordingly. And the MDBs have always been a bit more aligned in their thinking because they are used to working across, a health and a transport perspective or whatever it might be. So I think a better starting point is what is the best transport investment we could do at this time? And sure, then we can crunch some numbers that will justify some of the climate piece, but it wouldn't make sense to be doing it if it wasn't resilient at this point.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If you could see my notes on all of this, I could write a paper, but then I would have to cite you as the main sources of my, but I'm taking a lot of, yeah, of interesting notes. Thank you very much. I'm going to, given that we now have half an hour left, I want to open the floor for questions from the audience. I've already received a couple, and we've all received, but I want to give them a chance to maybe open their mic and do proper justice to their questions. I have a question from Christopher Kaczmarski. If you want to go ahead and ask, or I can ask for you, Christopher, but I was going to give you the chance to ask yourself if you want to open your mic.
Yes, so my question is regarding the best approach that you envision for engaging the private sector in adaptation, because this is a challenge. And who do you believe that should be the driver of this process?
Tough question, fine. Of course, the question is obviously have to be situated in a context. Depends on what which country you're talking about, what city we're talking about, etc. I mean, if we're talking about that kind of arrangement, and which kind of infrastructure. You know, it's completely different if you're trying to do something on the, let's say, active transportation side, which is relatively low investment, can be executed quickly, vis-a-vis a 50 or 60 year or 70-year concession for a mass transit system or something like that. So obviously it depends on the opportunities that are there. But I mean, the thing that's very simple, at least in most of the private sector stuff that I know and have worked with, even if it's PPP kind of financing, viability gap, etc., is that money will not flow uphill, fine. So the critical thing for us is to get the financials right. And that's, I think, part of where Sarah was coming from, and she had this interesting distinction between funding and financing. Many of the challenges we have, especially for transportation projects in the South, and that's true in other places also, including mass transit, is that most of them are unviable financially, and they have to be sort of subsidized, or something needs to get done with it from the land side or from other forms of grants or X and Y and Z to keep them up and running, mainly because of the structure of the investment. They're quite large. So I think one has to take that into account. So who is going to take the risk? And we've seen that at least in India and a number of places. You have private sector players who come into PPP financing structure, and then eventually they pull out after 5 or 10 years because the risk is too large for them to be able to manage, or it's better for them to exit and go out and do things. But I think basically the financial structuring and the revenue model that we're looking at is the core question that it needs to be dealt with. And at least in whatever little I know in this space, the investment requirements per whatever it is, passenger kilometer X, Y, and Z, could differ by many factors of, maybe not an order of magnitude, by a factor of 2 or 3 and 4. So it's not an abstract question. It's especially in a hybrid kind of environment where you have multiple systems that are running and you want to regulate them and try and do the best in terms of the social and economic good of the largest set of people. You're talking about sustainable development at the city scale. It becomes, I mean, we don't have frameworks to look at this kind of stuff and play them off very, very easily. So it's quite specific in some sense. It would be great if somebody did a wonderful PhD, thesis on a particular city and lays out something that might be within quote optimal or interesting, deals with the political economy with a little bit of game theory, etc. Some behavioral economics to do this kind of stuff. But I think that's a very fruitful area for inquiry.
Thanks, Aro. It is a tough question, Christopher. So let me see if I can add a different lens to what Aro just said, which is bang on. So certainly with the construction of new transport infrastructure, the private sector would typically be engaged by one of 3 mechanisms in terms of mobilizing the upfront financing. That would be debt. And I see that Helen's got a question lurking for us relating to that. So we'll address that thorny issue in a moment. Public-private partnerships and land-based financing. So land value capture, the sale of development rights and so on. And each of those would require you to think a bit differently about how to factor in adaptation and climate resilience into your investments. So in something like land-based financing, the risk to your private sector actors involved in that is going to be very stark. If you are building your transport in a low-lying coastal area or flood area, you are not going to have the kind of increases in land value necessary to pay for your investment, because properties are not going to rise in value, even if they're close to a transport hub, if they are flooded every year or experience this recurring storm surge or are devastated by cyclones or whatever your local threat would be in this space. With public-private partnerships, they're usually underpinned by some form of guarantee by the government. And so the government providing a guarantee to the private sector and not taking climate change into account is basically ensuring that that cost comes back to government balance sheets. So you have this imbalance of risk between the two parties concerning that. And again, we'll come to debt in a moment. So I think, and the choices that are made within countries about which of those three instruments would depend on a whole range of other factors. So, you know, Brazil and India have done a lot of really interesting experimentation with land-based financing of late. And that's possible because they've had some very sophisticated approaches to formalization of land and working with informal settlers to navigate informality and so on. Land-based financing is at a much more experimental stage across, say, most of sub-Saharan Africa. And so your capacity to crowd in private finance through that mechanism is diminished. Public-private partnerships are harder again. The sophistication of the contractual capacities required in government to get that risk and return ratio right, that you get a private sector partner, but you don't have the private sector partner walk away with all of the benefits and none of the risks is really complicated to do, especially now that we throw climate risk, physical and transition into the picture. So I guess the question there is almost, what is a country well placed to do in terms of its usual approach for engaging private sector partners in infrastructure investment? And then how do you take those particular set of instruments and build your climate considerations into them? Which is, you know, as ever with climate change, you know, how do you do something that was difficult anyway and make it that much harder?
Yeah, sorry, just to add to what Sarah was saying just now, the thing is, at country level, or at least at an aggregate level, you need to be able to pool all of these instruments and the climate risk that's associated with them to be able to actually deal with it. And we don't have the regulatory mechanisms or the institutional infrastructures to make this happen. So, you know, you have the question then is, which institution is going to carry this stuff? Obviously, in smaller countries, a development finance institution would come in and support this. But in larger countries, like Sarah was talking about, with slightly larger economies, federal structures, you have development finance institutions inside them. And for them also to manage their portfolios like this is completely kind of new stuff as far as that's concerned. And the question I would have again in the transport sector is, would they really go for a transport project to actually use climate financing for, or would they use other kinds of ways of trying to finance it to make it viable? That's, I think, the hard and the difficult question as far as that's concerned. And exactly what Sarah said is correct, because PPP management over the life cycle of the projects, I mean, you know, we don't know how it's actually going to play itself out. And even our frameworks for dealing with risk. I mean, for example, if there's a risk legislation, if there's a climate legislation that actually unbundles risks that comes in at national level, it changes the entire structure of a long-term PPP engagement, because suddenly there's a breakdown of sovereign and sub-sovereign risk and all right kind of things that are embedded in the climate legislation, which can actually change the risk environment and the contracting environment as far as that's concerned. And like I said, as far as debt is concerned, debt will not flow kind of uphill, right? So the debt that comes into this kind of thing has got many riders to it, especially, you know, and I think Helen has asked that question, if it comes to many of our parts of the world, like Mozambique, because there are a whole range of macro questions and rating questions that sit inside, which make it almost impossible for that money to flow there, even if you can actually use it. And then even if you can use it, you may not have large enough sizes of projects, or you'll have to bundle them across multiple things to make it worthwhile for somebody to actually make their investment, right? Because it's a whole string of investors sitting eventually in international markets that are dealing with that stuff, with the pension funds and, you know, a whole range of other players in this game.
Great. I can see that both Sarah and Aromar are also eager to answer Helen's question. So Helen is one of the brilliant TSU DPhil students. Helen, do you want to come in with your question, or should we just address what you've written in the chat? Was there something else that you wanted to complement?
I think you can address the question I've written.
Okay. Okay, I'm just gonna read it for everyone, although everyone can see it in the chat, but I'm gonna read it out loud and then I'll let you answer specifically. What are the effects of existing debts for countries into this kind of financing? For example, are countries with historical debt, e.g. Mozambique, able to get this kind of funding, or are they excluded due to their existing debt? Or are they unwilling to accept additional financing due to the extra debt burden that they will go into? Go ahead, please. You can either of you can start answering the question.
I guess my turn, right? Aro was really good about fielding the private sector one first, so I should probably take this one on the chin. Thanks for your question, Helen. It is a really good question and a really an even more important one now in the wake of the pandemic, when countries are looking incredibly stretched in terms of their debt sustainability. I think there's a two-part answer to your question. So the first part is, as we mentioned earlier, most transport requires pretty significant public finance to go with it, to make it, particularly large transport investments. They are just on their own, not logical, pure private sector investments. And so significant debt for a country rules that out, makes this difficult in two ways. The first thing is the money that they are losing to debt interest repayments, which reduces their fiscal envelope so that they have less resources domestically, often from very small balance sheets anyway, to put into these kind of projects to anchor private finance, or even for international public finance. It's often regarded as necessary that there's domestic investment alongside it to demonstrate public ownership, public commitment, etc., to the investment. And the second piece is that countries are not in a position to take on concessional loans if they are already debt stretched. So whether that is a loan from the private sector at higher commercial rates, or whether it is a concessional loan through the climate and development finance architecture, you're absolutely right to say that countries are no longer willing to accept that, because the consequences for the capacity to do other things at home, like pay social protection or invest in healthcare, pay public sector salaries, etc. So it is, I have no good news. It is just a bad situation to be in, and it does absolutely preclude that capacity to invest in transport infrastructure. I think the only thing I would add to that is that there's belated but growing recognition of that in the climate and development finance architecture space. A number of entities are trying to work to find opportunities for debt relief. Once again, as you mentioned, Gordon Brown, in your question, to come around and work through this and find solutions. The systems in place at the moment are not always right. So there has been a lot of excitement about the International Monetary Fund's new Sustainability and Resilience Trust, which by some measures is seen as creating free money from rich countries for poor countries, and that can be straightforwardly transferred. The reason I question this one is that the IMF doesn't intervene in the aftermath of physical hazards. It intervenes in the aftermath of public finance hazards. And so you don't have access to those kind of resources until you've had your financial shock. And so you automatically are moving to disaster response and recovery, as opposed to moving to reduce those, to anticipate financial and physical risks and be in a position to reduce them. So the recognition of debt sustainability and its importance for acting on not just climate change, but any other pressing domestic and global public good issues is recognized in the multilateral system now, but the response is not adequate.
Yeah, I mean, I spot on in that sense. The thing is, you know, let's take a practical example. If you wanted to put a BRT system into into Mobutu, let's say that is a good thing to do, which seems viable as far as concerned. The question then is how do you get it financed? And you know, one of the obvious things when people come in and do the appraisal is to see where the cash flows will come at the other end of the day. Is it going to come from users? Is it going to come from, you know, the local municipality? Is it going to come from transfers from the national government? So the cash flow stuff is obviously critical. And if it's a long-term infrastructure, BRT, maybe you do a 30-year kind of appraisal, etc. on that. It may be a little bit easier. The critical question, I think, inside this is the debt is sitting at a higher level and influencing both the interest rates. And that becomes a critical thing when you're doing discounted cash flow at one end, and also your ratings. So, I mean, you know, it's a back and forth. So most countries in our parts of the world that have close to junk investment ratings, they have a direct impact on their cost of capital. But the question then is, okay, if you do debt relief, let's say, will it trickle down eventually into the transport sector, or maybe it should be going into health or education, into the social sector, etc. So those are, I think, larger questions which are difficult to kind of mediate and build some kind of a frame that connects up the project level stuff that would often happen in transportation, unless it's a very big, not a, like a BRT thing, if it were a port or a large airport, which would be a big economic infrastructure that could be structured differently, and the macro questions of debt relief, because it's like budgetary support. The fungibility of that and how that may be directed to something specific, is very severe, especially in many countries where the capital flight is a bigger issue in some senses than the debt, because underlying the debt is a massive capital flight that's happening below that, which nobody measures. And that's directly tied to the political economy of those environments and large projects like this. So in some senses, large infrastructure projects are the fulcrum on which the capital flight actually exists in some places. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be that way, but that's the way it actually does work in many parts of the world. And this is not only true of the so-called developing world. If you look at the history of infrastructure in the United States, etc., from the 1860s onwards, there's a lot of this stuff that's happening in various places.
Thank you both. Oh, great. We have a question from Hannah Putniks, which is also a part of the TSU research team. Hannah, do you want to complement your question somehow? Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how clearly I've written it or if it makes sense, but I was just kind of wondering, there's all this other investment that's going on, maybe because the IMF has intervened for something else, or maybe because various countries that are not part of the climate finance infrastructure have decided to build transport infrastructure anyway, as we know about from our last seminar. Is there a way or to intervene in these sort of financial arrangements and project implementation after the fact to make them more about climate mitigation and adaptation, and to be able to kind of almost restructure them in a way that's more beneficial, rather than just kind of letting them carry on and ignoring the fact that they might make things a lot worse?
Sarah, you want to jump in on that? Just a very interesting question.
It's a very interesting question. I guess maybe I've misinterpreted the question, Hannah. Please come back to me if I have done so. But I guess there's a sovereignty issue, right? So, there's certainly a scenario where you have a lot of voices in the US pointing the finger over at China and saying, why are you building highways and coal-fired power plants, and you should be doing lower carbon things? And why are you building it here where there's going to be a floodplain? But what is the system by which we intervene in the US? So it's a very, it's a question around conditionalities. If an international community is providing financing for something, then there is a degree of legitimacy in intervening or imposing conditionalities to ensure that that is lower carbon or more climate resilient. But I think, and that is certainly under most of the OECD architecture and most of the climate accord architecture, systems are in place to ensure that they are imperfect. The ADB and the World Bank and the Green Climate Fund are all funding things that are not perfect, but they have been through processes to try and make them more perfect, to encourage countries and implementing partners to think through how to improve them. If there is not international finance for this, there's not a justification to intervene. It is a country's choice, even if it has global ramifications. And those of us with Australian accents who have been locking ourselves into carbon emissions for some generations would not be able to intervene in any moral way on that kind of question.
Just to Hannah, interesting question. I think maybe thought experiment. The thought experiment would be, what is China actually doing with the BRI? Both in the BRI and also in Africa, because there are massive investments happening in transportation and infrastructure, vis-a-vis investment that comes from Europe, which has certain ways of looking at things, and their financing arrangements are a little bit different versus stuff that comes from the US. That I think, I mean, it's an interesting research question. I don't know the answer to it, but basically, I think one has to kind of think about this. I mean, this is partially a question of a stranded asset that's stranded because of two reasons. One is, or potentially stranded. I mean, it may not be stranded now, but it will be stranded, right? One is because it's dirty. It's it's got a lot of carbon inside it, and you can start fixing that. So you can. I mean, one is the rectification of a system, and trying to reduce the carbon emissions that come from it. That's and then you've got to go to scope 2 and 3, and most of the analysis doesn't go that far. That's one part of it. The second question, like Sarah was saying, taking the example of something that's in a floodplain or next to the coast, where you have the physical risks that's there. I think the unbundling into those two kinds of risks, the transition risk and how that will be financed, because there are different sets of folks who function in that market, the instruments and the back end of that system is a little bit different from the physical risk, which is much more tied in with the disaster risk stuff, with the reinsurance industry that's used to these kind of events. I guess the thing there is you have to actually blend the two together, because typically you will find there's a dirty infrastructure in the wrong place, right? And the people who are going to, over time, provide the escrow financing for it because of the whatever user fees they're going to pay are no longer going to be there or can't afford it. I mean, I'm just sort of setting up a case of something that might actually fail. So you need to be able to sort of think through those processes, build the scenarios, and work backwards to try and see how that, like Sarah was saying, how that risk would potentially be unbundled. And in some cases, whatever I've seen, or some of what I've seen of Chinese finance, depending on whether it's useful or not politically, they'll underwrite that risk. But that may not be so for something that comes out of New York or even London, for that matter, in terms of who's holding that asset. So the creation of these new asset classes and sets of people who are willing to actually hold those asset classes. There are people who are willing to hold nuclear power plants on their risk portfolio. Not many, but there are people who actually play against the market, taking large financial decisions based on that. So the world is full of really exciting people, especially finance.
Well, I mean, I think it's quite interesting that you say that, because you're also kind of bringing in not just issues of sovereignty if it's a nation state doing this investment, but also if it's private sector investment and even oil companies basing their bets and their risks. They're like, well, if I can get that many, lock this in that much more, then, and there's unfortunately, how do you get them to make different decisions? But
exactly, our biggest players are doing both coal and renewables at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's how you, I mean, if you're sitting as a CFO or you're sitting on as a portfolio manager, you'll play both ends, and you look at the futures market and both things and figure out how to play that. Especially at this time, this is a fantastic time to play that space. Once oil prices start going up $60 a barrel, that's a whole range of new creatures come out from the undergrowth.
Great. Thank you both. We only have and Hannah for that question. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm gonna start closing. But I wanted to, if you want to add some like closing remarks or anything of the sort, Sarah and Aromar. But I was going to ask you if you could kind of, as a way of summarizing my proposal, is maybe have the two things that you think that we're doing right and the two things that we think that we can improve in this context of climate change adaptation financing. But feel free to steer away from those prompts. But just some closing remarks in the next 5 minutes so that we can close the session. Who wants to start?
I think Aro should, since I got to present first before and I want more time to think.
Makes sense.
No, I think the simple thing on the adaptation side is many people, or let's say an increasing number of people, are recognizing that the mitigation story is really important and we should really work very hard. But our commitments are going to take us to hell. So I mean, the indices are the fast elevator to hell. They're 2.7 to 3, and we're not moving that much in that direction in spite of COVID, et cetera, et cetera. So we're on track to hit 2.7 at the current point of time. So 1.5 is a wonderful thing, and lots of people and things and places are going to suffer tremendously, even going from 1.1 to 1.5. But what's going to happen in the the journey to 2 and beyond that is kind of unimaginable. So the fact is that even in places that are better endowed, people are thinking seriously about adaptation. So basically, you go like hell for the 1.5 and you pray for everybody else, but you better plan for 2.7, right? And if that's the story, then even the structure of where financing and development, investment, etc. will shift over time. We already know that there's a factor of 3 or 6 between, the 100 billion is like small change as far as it's concerned. Transition risks are in the trillions, right? But then the question is, where are those resources going to come from? Is it going to come from taking away the subsidies? And, is it going to come because there's going to be leaving more stuff in the ground, et cetera, carbon in the ground? Those are things that will play themselves out in the macroeconomy. So the story on adaptation is becoming stronger. The challenge is that in the framework that we have today, including for transportation, that's why I'm coming back to that risk-weighted, cost of capital question. The challenge that we have today is that we don't have adequate metrics. We don't have an adaptation goal. Right? It's not an easy thing to construct. There'll be a lot of, trench warfare in the next few years trying to figure out what needs to get done. And it may be impossible to define one because it's so diverse and it's kind of bottom up in some senses. But in the financing world, if you don't have a way of trying to value it and to be able to measure it and for somebody to sign off on it, the money won't flow, or at least it won't flow in the direction that you want it to go. Even though there's demand there may be even some ways of actually being able to fund it, which is the irony in some ways, right? Especially in countries where economies are growing, you can finance some of this stuff. There are ways to make it. I mean, you can fund some of this stuff, but the financing will not flow because of all the other considerations. So adaptation is growing. There's going to be more resources coming in it, but we don't know how to get the market to be able to match that. And in some cases, there's no way that the market can actually function in that space. Right? So then, is it going to be left just to households or enterprises to take the risk and manage with that and build the resilience? Is it going to be funded from the public exchequer, and how is that going to be valued? Those are interesting questions that I think we have to start asking. Sorry, Sarah, I took your time.
No, not at all. Anytime. I feel like I opened by primarily talking about not just 2 things, but many things we're doing wrong. So I'm going to just talk about 2 things that I think we're doing right, not necessarily in transport, but that have lessons for transport. And apologies, I know this is like terrible undergraduate essay style where someone throws out whole new ideas in our last paragraph, but nonetheless, here we are. So the first one is I would really encourage you to go and look at the South African Just Energy Transitions Partnership. It's this new deal, not finalized yet, still in the works, but if they get it right, it's really promising, whereby 5 wealthy governments are committing $8.5 billion to help South Africa to decarbonize its energy system. And that is not an $8.5 billion price tag. It's actually a $65 billion price tag. But most of that money should come from private finance, because investments in renewable energy pay for themselves once you have moved some of the barriers that you currently face in South Africa, which are political and regulatory, and the cost of decommissioning its coal-fired power plants. And so what is really striking about this deal is it's a big step for climate finance, because it's a bunch of donors working together to help South Africa make a step change that it wants to do anyway, because South Africa's electricity system is not working for South Africans and for the neighboring economies that it supplies. They have rolling power outages that are stifling industry, job creation, affecting healthcare, education. They need to sort out their electricity anyway. The whole world wants them to do it in a low carbon way, and 8.5 billion will help unlock that opportunity. And we should be thinking similarly about bold deals we can offer to key countries on adaptation or mitigation. So what is needed for Indonesia to have all of its buses become electric over the next 10 years? What kind of, that will make financial sense at some point, but what concessional finance is needed to help get it over the line? And that's happening on a small scale, like the Nauru port, but it's not happening in key economies at scale. And the second thing I want to throw out in my minus 2 minutes to go is this incredibly techie, nerdy thing called Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, which is closely linked to the climate finance goal, because it's the other major place that the climate accords speak about finance. But the aspiration in 2.1c is this idea of getting all financial flows aligned behind the Paris Agreement's mitigation and adaptation targets. So the idea is, as Aro mentioned before, that all spending and all investment and all lending should be aiming to mitigate for 1.5 degrees and should be aiming to adapt for 2.7. We should not have any country that is designing a transport project and says, we're only going to choose this low carbon option if you cough up X billion dollars, or we're only going to put this in a place that's less exposed to floods if you cough up X billion dollars. That's not to say there shouldn't be international concessional finance in the mix. There absolutely should be, but especially for transport, most of the story is all the rest of the finance. And the fact that that's currently going to all the oil barons at $60 a barrel it makes no sense for any of the next 10,000 years.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you both, Aromar and Sarah. Thank you very much. Thank you to thanks to all the audience that joined us. I'm afraid we need to close the session now. So we won't address Jin Ho's question. This, as I said at the beginning, this has been recorded and it's going to be posted in the TSU webpage in due time. Thank you very, very much to all of you and our special guest. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, JP. Thank you, Aro. Always a pleasure.
Bye, Sarah. Bye, JP. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.